Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and happy Black History Month to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Bonjour tout le monde. Bon mois de l'histoire des Noirs. Merci de nous rejoindre. Before I continue, I do want to thank, in a very big way, our Lieutenant-Governor of Ontario, the Honourable Elizabeth Dowdeswell, Alexandra Tichinoff, who's a senior advisor in her office, and of course the entire team for making this possible. And of great importance, before we begin, is we acknowledge that the land of the Office of the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize the International Decade for People of African Descent proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly. The decade calls for the international community to recognize that people of African descent are a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected. We remember the millions of Africans who were stolen from their homeland, on whose shoulders we stand. We remember those whose bodies lie at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. We remember those who fought, bled, and died for freedom. We remember those who continue to challenge anti-Black racism in its many manifestations. In that same vein, as we gather for a discussion about arts and culture, we give thanks for the members of the Coalition for the Truth About Africa who protested against and called for an apology from the Royal Ontario Museum for its racist exhibition Into the Heart of Africa, which opened in November 1989. It was not until November 2016, 27 years later, that the ROM would issue an apology for contributing to anti-African racism and the suffering endured by the African Canadian community, and announce initiatives to improve its relationship with the community. Many CFTA members were vilified and are still hurt by the experience, yet persevere. In the words of Dr. Akua Benjamin, resistance is in our DNA. May we never relent in our fight for justice. Your Honor, I now turn the floor over to you. Madame Lieutenante-gouverneure, à vous la parole.
Thank you very much, Dave, and hello everyone. Bonjour, bonjour. Je suis très heureuse d'être ici avec vous cet après-midi as we celebrate Black History Month and continue to mark the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent. I warmly welcome all of you to this timely conversation. So many of us have precious memories of the uplifting public art events that we attended before the pandemic. Some of the ones that stand out for me were Robert Young's Young World Faces at the Pan American Games, which left such an indelible impression. Kumba 25 at the Harbourfront Centre, and of course Mandela, Struggle for Freedom at the Meridian Arts Centre, where I was able to share some of my own experiences of living in Africa and actually having the honor of meeting Mandela, where I had those conversations with Miss Karen Carter, whom you hear from today. And of course, today I'm thinking of Dan Hill as he's being inducted into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame. I must admit I've been humming sometimes when we touch all morning. And we're all basking in our collective Canadian pride for the weekend performance last night at the Super Bowl. Each of these events and so many more showcased the rich cultural history and the contemporary vibrancy of Ontario's and Canada's Black communities. Although art is experienced in individual and personal ways, for me, these events were most compelling when I was able to experience them with you in the company of others. But since then, so much has changed. We know the pandemic has had a significant and disproportionate impact on the Black community. It's also particularly affected the arts and arts workers. With facilities necessarily closed, performance artists may be unemployed, while visual artists have lost some of the traditional spaces for spaces and venues for expression. And yet, the creative spirit endures. There is no question then that the work being done by today's speakers is absolutely vital. Art plays an essential role in raising awareness of and probing into the systemic challenges we face. I think, for instance, of the murals, the signs, the words spelled out on city streets, and the artwork shared on social media over the past year in support of the Black Lives Movement. Art can also spark visions of what a more inclusive world could look like, and it can encourage those who view it to dream about how to get there. You know, in his memoir, Go to School, You're a Little Black Boy, my predecessor, Lincoln Alexander, wrote, "The arts bring people together, and the main thing is that the shared experience open doors of communication." Even though the way we share experiences has now shifted, art can still open these doors between people of every generation. I remember vividly visiting Heart of Africa, Retracing Our History, which was a multimedia exhibition at Newmarket's Old Town Hall. I was in the company of a group of young women from the community support organization Trust 15. And I saw firsthand their curiosity, their enthusiasm. I saw it through someone else's eyes, and it was truly inspiring. Art can build bridges between communities as well, fostering the empathy that we need and are going to need to bring about a more equal, just society. It's so crucial to strengthening resilience and bolstering recovery. Today's speakers that we're going to be treated to are providing leadership that is truly transformative. In these disruptive times, through the institutions and organizations they represent, they're finding innovative ways to support marginalized and disenfranchised artists while bringing their work to a wide audience. So as Lieutenant Governor, I thank immensely Karen Carter, Josh Dyer, Shelley Falconer, and Gaëtane Verna for their leadership in the Black arts community and for being with us here today to share your insights. I'm looking forward to a stirring discussion. Thank you all for attending. Merci à tous d'être des nôtres. Miigwech.
Merci, Votre Honneur. Thank you very much, Your Honor. We're almost going to jump right into our panel discussion that you've all been waiting for. But just so you all know how it is that we got to this moment was, sometime last year I approached the Office of the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, having attended last year's event, which was the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the report of the Commission on the Status of Women in Canada. And that in itself was a riveting discussion, a lively discussion in which these experts, women who really understood the issues at the time and contemporary politics today, could talk about the progress where gender is concerned in Canada today and the status of women today. And I thought, we have Black History Month coming up. And it got me thinking about how many of us know about the role or the office of the Lieutenant Governor. How many of us have ever been to Queen's Park? How many of us have ever been inside the Lieutenant Governor's suite at Queen's Park? How many of us understand what the role of the LG is? So had this not been in pandemic conditions, we would have all been huddled nicely into the LG suite at Queen's Park. So we can be in that space, see that space, and experience that space. With respect to the topic itself, in our community, we've discussed ad nauseum, and we have reports ad nauseum about anti-Black racism in education, healthcare, policing, criminal justice, you name it, all the other major systems. We rarely ever give time and attention to arts and culture. And we have a unique situation. We're fortunate that we have 3 strong Black women leading institutions that aren't necessarily designed around our community, that are at the forefront, that occupy these spaces, that are breaking those glass ceilings and all the other ceilings that need to be shattered to amplify our voices and our lived experiences and really think about how do we all become represented in these institutions that weren't designed about us. And with that, I won't hold you back from them any further. So let me introduce to you Karen Carter, the Executive Director of the MacLaren Arts Centre, Shelley Falconer, who is the President and CEO of the Art Gallery of Hamilton, Madame Gaëtane Verna, who is the Director of the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery, And last but not least, your moderator, Josh Dyer, who's the Director of Marketing at Myseum of Toronto. Ladies and gent, over to you. Oh, last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, the Q&A is open for you to pose your questions as you see fit, right throughout our discussion. Vous êtes invités à poser des questions en anglais et en français aussi. So enjoy today's discussion. Josh?
Thank you so much, Dave. I'd also like to extend my thanks and gratitude to the Lieutenant Governor and her staff, and as well all of today's panelists for joining us. I really feel like I'm in an esteemed company, and as my friend and colleague Karen Carter likes to say, breathing rarefied air at the moment. So thank you all for joining us. I'm just going to get right into things. One of the great things about the panel that we have today is you all obviously have a wealth of experience, but also come from sort of varied backgrounds in terms of the institutions that you represent. So I'd love if each of you could introduce yourself, a little bit about your work and about the organizations that you work for, so we can all get an idea of how they differ, because I think that's one of the great things about this discussion today is we're going to get a little bit from all angles of different institutions and different arts and culture institutions in Ontario. So I am going to hand it over to Karen to get things started. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. I guess it is fitting. I'm the smallest of the three, I think. I am at a collecting institution. I will admit that I'm new, kid on the block, also at the MacLaren, having started officially January 4th, but it is a institution that is rooted in the presentation of arts and culture at the MacLaren Arts Center in Barrie, in downtown Barrie. It's a beautiful award-winning building that's was done by C. MacLaren. It's actually 20 years old this June. As I said, we're a collecting institution on the medium to small size, and our mandate is focused on collecting Canadian art, but also presentation of that work that is collected for the public trust and public good for Barrie proper, but also for Simcoe County. And we are the largest cultural institution in the region. It's a team of 13, the staff, and a board of directors that is helping to oversee the work that we do at the organization.
Thank you so much, Karen. Shelley, you also represent a collecting institution, so if you can tell us a little bit about the Art Gallery of Hamilton.
Sure. Hello, everyone, and Your Honor, thank you again for hosting and organizing this event, and I'm so honored to be here with my colleagues and friends, Gaëtane and Karen. I think what is interesting is that we really do represent three distinct organizations, and I am probably the oldest organization that's here. In fact, we are the oldest continuous civic art gallery in the province of Ontario, and we're the third largest collection in the province after the National Gallery of Canada and the Art Gallery of Ontario. What's interesting in the context of this conversation is this is a collection that's over 100 years old. Hamilton was at one time the industrial cradle for Canada, and it's where not only our steel companies were, but most of many American head offices and industrial head offices. So there are a lot of industrialists and I would call it Canadian establishment money that built the collection that I represent. And I think the reason I raise that is because so many of our collections in Canada are passively organized versus active. And by that I mean that we are the recipient of donations and gifts and purchases. There are not many of us with large acquisition budgets. So I think our collections often represent very much the history of the times. And our collection is very much that. It has a very important Tom Thomson Group 7 collection. It has a very important international collection, the well-known Tenenbaum collection, as well as some Inuit Indigenous, the Chidot collections here. But when you look at what is in our collection, and I think this is an area that we're going to talk about soon, I know, the problematic area for our institutions with collections. We are largely a collection that represents white men. In fact, 12% of our collection represents women, and that's high for most art museum collections. That is quite high. And then only about 2.5% represents Indigenous or persons of color. So I leave you with that, because I think that presents enormous challenges for organizations of not only my size, but the type of collection in terms of the discussion that will follow.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Yes, you are correct. The three very distinct natures of the institutions that each of you represent is going to be a big part of today's discussion. So thank you for really outlining that for us. Last but definitely not least, Gaëtane at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery, a non-collecting institution and quite different from the institutions that Karen and Shelley represent. So Gaëtane, if you could tell us a little bit about your work at the Power Plant.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. So the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery is a department of Harbourfront Center. And in 2022, we'll be celebrating the 35th anniversary of the opening of the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery. So we're non-collecting type of Kunsthalle model, which means that we mainly focus on exhibiting artists, publication, touring, exhibition, and education and public programs. So unlike Shelley, Falconer, or Karen Carter, we do not have any collections, but we produce temporary exhibition. And one of the elements that we've been focusing a lot on is this notion of publications, which enable more documentation of Canadian artists to be produced, because publications are costly. No one makes money out of publication, but they're also essential in terms of our ability to study and research the artists that we present. We have a team of about 19 to 22 full-time staff. And over the years, when we're not, closed because of the pandemic, we usually have 3 cycles of programming, one in the fall, one in the winter, and one in the summer, as well attach a whole series of education and public programs for youth, for family, for adults, and general. So the last thing is we're governed by a board of about 23 people, and essentially a board that is there to support, to steward the institution, to support it financially, but also in the role of governance of the institution.
Thank you so much. All of these descriptions of the institutions you represent are going to be very important, and it will be apparent very soon in the conversation. But first, I'd like to jump right into something. We have you 3 on the call today. And if you look around the larger sort of art and culture sector in Ontario, you do not see a lot of folks that look like us. And so I would like to pose this question as to why are there so few Black leadership positions in the arts? And what can we do to expand that? And what are some of the obstacles that we're currently facing in terms of how this sector is currently structured? I'll open that up to anyone who wants to kick that off.
I'd be happy to start. I would start with the pipeline that a lot of us come out of and have come out of. And I would first also say that the 3 of us, and we've discussed this before, we come from privilege, that we have the education of it. But I would say that, the pipeline that produces museum professionals tend to be these programs at universities, at schools, art schools, that are fairly white, can be elitist, And so that when you look at who those professionals are, and I think about one of the programs, and I'm just going to throw one out, that I was at 20 years ago now at the University of Toronto in Museum Studies. In the 2 years I was there was never a person of color in the program. And I remember a student that I was friends with in the history department, a graduate student who was Black, saying to me, "How come I've never heard of your program? How come there are no people of color in your program except you?" So, and that's pretty well been my experience. And I went to school for a very long time. So I was in a lot of different programs here and abroad. And I would say that was fairly consistent. So I would start with just looking at the education system and the pipeline that produces museum professionals.
I would jump in to talk about just mentorship. And to Shelley's point, I think we all admit a level of privilege in our own upbringing. And I want to unpack what I mean by privilege in saying my family was middle class. I grew up in the east end of Scarborough with a truck driving father and 4 siblings, and which was the core of my family's trajectory at that time. And although my father was never excited about anything to do with me working in arts and culture, I was conditioned to believe that I could do whatever I wanted to do. I just had to work hard to do it. So I never walked into my time in university and the choices around working in this sector ever being in the room alone and feeling uncomfortable. I just feel like I can be anywhere. And I think sometimes because we're in a sector that needs to get a lot of work done in order to allow that upward mobility for people, not only at the leadership level, but just across all of the different paradigms. That element of at home for parents with their kids that begins with just that sense of whatever you want to do, you can do, I think was a major factor for me. I think both Shelley and Gaëtane have time that they spent in institutions that are world-renowned in Europe. I didn't do any of that. I'm an undergrad from York. I did a master's in education at U of T. But I came through volunteerism with things like Cambaya, which is the precursor for me, at least, to BAND, which was Canadian Artists Network, Black Artists in Action. It was a Black culture organization that was national at a time in the 80s that would have been super radical for that work to be done nationally. So I think the balance of how you are formed and the identity that you have that comes from that personal network of family and support system is as important as walking into an industry like this that can be super intimidating and difficult, especially if you're not seen as coming with the right educational pedigree. And then the next layer of it is the experimentation that you have to be okay with. Every time I meet with young people now that are coming from racialized communities, Black ones and other BIPOC groups, I always say that they should start things because you're going to learn things from experimenting and starting things that are community-centered that you may not necessarily learn. I've always said that my time at Myseum was possible because of the 10 years spent building BAND. So I knew because of that process how to do things from scratch. So yeah, I think the ability to be in the leadership role that I'm in has come partly from that core family unit that formed me. And I have to, in respect as well to the weekend last night, I have to hail Scarborough. Like when you grow up in a community that diverse with people from all over the world, a lot of families that are just starting and building, there's just no fear about otherness. And I think as Canadians, we sometimes downplay the benefit of the fact that we are normally raising kids in really diverse communities, and the benefit of that is something that should impact how you cultivate leadership comes from those core elements of what your worldview is like as a kid. So for me, those things are what form the DNA in me that allows me to just be comfortable anywhere with, as my grandmother would say, comfortable. You raise children to sup with kings and paupers and to treat each with the respect and dignity that they deserve as human beings.
Karen Carter never passes up an opportunity to give a shout out to Scarborough. Much deserving. Big up to Scarborough, though. Gaëtane, do you have any thoughts to share on this idea of why there are so few Black leadership positions in the arts and culture sector in Ontario?
Well, I would say that I concur, with what my colleagues have all mentioned, but I think also one of the elephant in the room is also who hires whom, right? How do headhunters, when they're looking for, when they're asked, headhunters or staff or HR departments, when they're looking to fill a position, who do they contact to ask for advice and to have names be brought forward, and who has had the opportunity to be, as Karen said, mentored, to be in a position to have enough opportunities to gain the knowledge within, scopes of different positions, because you don't necessarily get to a leadership position, from finishing an MA or BA and getting there. So you need a community of people that will steward you and help you to develop the different muscles, the different knowledge that you need to be ready for a position such as that. So where are you able to get internships? If, as Shelley mentioned, now I think things are getting much better because everybody has understood that if we want change in our field, we cannot no longer have these unpaid internships, which are only beneficial to people who are financially stable enough to do a 1 year, 2 year, 3 years of different types of internship without getting any financial compensation. So the question of class is also there. I mentioned the question of who is doing the hiring. And then the last thing is the hiring committee, the boards, who have to think that they're choosing somebody that will represent. When you represent an institution, you take a leadership, you represent a community, you are out there speaking on behalf at the service of your institution. So the people who are doing this hiring must feel confident and must also forgo their own biases, because maybe if you think of how so few children, and I mean, when we were at school, I was lucky enough, I was raised in Montreal, and in my high school, my mom was a teacher. In my high school, I had teachers from all over the world. But it's true that my siblings and I remember when Monsieur Kodada was our first physics teacher who came from Haiti, and he was the first Black teacher I ever had in my life. So imagine whether it's staff having never had a person of color lead them. They don't see Black people in leadership position. The people who do the hiring wonder if the staff will be comfortable. They have to forego their own internal biases about, can this person really speak on our behalf? So there's layers and layers of reasons why there's so few. But I must say that when and Shelley often refers to that, when we join, let's say, our colleagues at, on national museum committees, I'm very proud of the diversity that I see in Ontario and Toronto taking a leadership, because if we think of TIFF, if we think of Soul Pepper, if we think of the AGO with Julie Crooks, if we think also at the City of Toronto with Cheryl Blackman, there's a few of us that are Black people in very important leadership roles in Ontario. So I would say that on this point, Toronto is really leading the conversation on a national basis, but and so it should. But it's true across the country, there's so much work to be done.
Thank you, Gaëtane. I think it is true. You raised a number of names, all of which I know we're quite fond of, who are doing great work, and much of that change is something we've seen quite recently. You all brought up some of the obstacles, and Gaëtane, you even started getting into what could be some possible solutions in terms of diversifying this sector. One thing we've seen is even organizations like banks and other corporations have really sort of embraced and adopted change at what seems to be a more rapid rate than the museum sector itself when it comes to issues of diversity, inclusion, equity, and access. Why do you think it's different in the arts and culture or museum sector?
I'd be happy to start. I think between three of us, it's going to be a longer conversation. I think again, over the arc of my career, over 25 years, there has been an ebb and flow, I would call it that, of a conversations around diversity. We should all remember excellence and equity was, that was written in the 90s out of the States. But it took really, in some ways, that surge that happened last year with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that moment when museums, galleries were put under the microscope. So I have really found this concerted effort has started since about a year ago. And I'm sorry to say, but we are in the very early days. And I think it's because we were a sector that was able to get away with it. The data has been clear for years now. Studies, the Mellon Foundation started with studies, 2015, Canadian Art did one, 2017, Mellon Foundation began in 2018. And it showed very clearly that within the museum sector, in both the States and Canada, when you look at the leadership roles and the professional roles, we're something at 89% are white. And that's dropped only in the last few years, a few percentage points. So the fact that it's been going on for so long with such appalling data demonstrates that I just don't think the accountability was as high as maybe the other sectors. But I have to say, the marked change that I'm seeing that's beginning as of last summer, I think this will really be a catalyst for change. So, I think I'll start there because I think it's a bigger story.
I might be a bit cynical, but I guess maybe I don't necessarily see the trajectory as being about the movement from last summer. And for instance, if I think of where the three of us are, if I think of Dr. Crooks, if I think of even Cheryl, who previously was at a pretty senior role for years at the ROM, I think there is this weird invisible creep that's been happening, and that the focus for me started to shift with Canada 150, where the focus was very much on Indigenous representation. And we know of things like the Indigenous Curatorial Collective that is starting to challenge what change looks like with respect to Indigenous representation, where things, for instance, that have become commonplace, like land acknowledgements and so forth, and a lot of museums and cultural organizations and institutions focusing on delivering programs that are in partnership with Indigenous voices. So I had a conversation with colleagues last summer where we talked about just the overall paradigm shift around diversity, access, inclusion conversations that go from the 80s, late 70s, 80s, which was very civil service focused, things that were about quotas and just the idea of make sure affirmative action type movements are being made to fill positions. I think that shift started to show our presence happening more in the funding bodies. So the Black folks that are represented at Canadian Heritage or at Ontario Arts Council or even at Toronto Arts Council is directly connected for me in how the civil service research in equity and diversity then impacts where hiring happens there. Then I think you're right, Shelley, in that some of the benchmarks where, again, those reports that Canada Council and others around, they'll send the reports to say, we want to see this represented not only in the civil service, but in the hiring for the institutions that they're funding. But there seems to have always been a disconnect where the hiring would be women. So then it became more white women or women of color, but not necessarily Black women, and then Indigenous folks. So I think there have been waves, and then the LGBTQ community. So I think we saw the change with women or more representation of women. We saw more representation with respect to LGBTQ. And we know, for instance, I think if you did an assessment of equity, diversity, senior roles, a lot of those positions ended up in LGBTQ-led references. And I feel like this last bastion is the Black piece that is starting to then push. And it's happening where there's almost this intersection of what you've seen around the data and research with respect to representation, what you see with respect to, which is really this slog of people, which goes back to that conversation we seem to always have just privately among ourselves of, you have to be super strong to just push against otherness. So a lot of us who did that are now senior enough to deal in this space, but we come to that with a heightened sense of lift as you climb. So we're starting to start things like you guys did with the Black Curators Forum that Dr. Crooks and Gaëtane founded, to just think, okay, now that we're here, the climate seems to be ready. How can we make sure we push forward? But you push forward thinking both about your individual capability, systemic things that you can create or tap into, but also keeping the pressure on, to Josh's point, those systemic elements that for us within the creative and cultural sector, there is a greater intersection between public policy. That's, I mean, even the fact that our LG is hosting this conversation kind of, for me, directly links to how civil service and public policy is really where we get our alignment. Arts and culture seems to not pay attention to private sector as much, unless we're, courting them for potential funds and partnerships. But we're not necessarily looking at the fact that they're often moving forward because they equate diverse representation to their business practices being more successful. That's even now, as we see the Black Lives Matter movement, that's the way things like Black North and the other entities that are being formed to deal with these questions from a financial and business standpoint are framing things. So for me, there's this whole complex soup of the intersection between public policy, representation within those research paradigms, and then our role in public, private, nonprofit, charity realms that often people say the right things, but as we know, the delivery is way behind. And it just makes it even more complex to unpack.
Karen, you brought up the Black Curators Forum, which, and for those who don't know, who are up on the call today, that forum wrote a rather groundbreaking letter that was published in Canadian Art Magazine this past summer. And one of the interesting things that I really found about that article was, the folks who are part of that Curators Forum are already folks who have broken through. They're already in the system. And one of the things that letter talked about is addressing what it addressed was the climate once you're in these spaces. And so I'd love if you all could share your thoughts on that. It's one thing to break through and get the role at the institution, but then what is the climate in which you're operating once you're there? And then I guess secondly, as leaders now in the sector, how does that influence your leadership practice? How do you ensure that those spaces then become more inclusive, more accessible, more equitable, et cetera?
I can jump in. I think that I'm continually thankful to my parents for the way they raised me, meaning that, when, first you have to get the job, but when you get the job, the way they allow people 100 days, they don't allow us not 100 days. They allow us no time. Failure is never an option. What they would allow a white leader to do, what a white leader can feel comfortable doing as walking into a job and changing the whole upper management, and everybody's going to go, wow, dynamic, visionary. In our case, if we do that, the people who hire you will listen to lower level staff and their complaints and will start automatically questioning your leadership because you're a person of color, because you're Black. So when you walk into these spaces, you have to be ready and solid to have a vision that is I always started with this notion that if I'm given the opportunity to lead an organization, I owe it to myself and to the organization that I'm serving to bring my best foot forward and to bring change in increments, because whereas a white leader can change, easily, we cannot do this. We have to massage people. We have to speak to them. We have to be good managers, which I think we are actually better managers, because we're always thinking of the perspective of the employee that's in front of us, of the other, of how they're going to take these changes, whereas a white leader can just walk in there and do whatever they see fit and be valued as somebody of a lot of dynamism. And when you mentioned the Black Curators Forum, the reason we basically started this, and this was together with colleagues Dominique Fontaine and Pamela Edmonds, was really that we were looking at how the Indigenous Curatorial Collective had regrouped, and you kind of create the safe space where we can all exchange together, be supportive of each other, and also in this time of reckoning. And we started the Black Curators Forum in 2019. It was really from our thought process of how can we create a space where we can grow outside of our organization and henceforth bring it back to our work. So I think this self-care, to say really, and self-help group and resources that you find outside of your field, because we cannot have this discussion inside of our organizations. We cannot have these discussions with our boards. We cannot have these discussions with our HR department, and we cannot have this discussion even in the collectivity of our field. So we need to figure out how to find best practices, how to exchange outside the organization. And I think that once you're in those positions, you really, and that's where I really feel that one of the things Karen just mentioned is that I can tell you that some of the success that I have had at the power plant together with our team is that the vision that we had was very much supported by the different strategic initiatives of the different fundraising bodies, right? If we're thinking of Toronto Arts Council, Ontario Arts Council, and Canada Council, embedding these values of diversity within their granting requirements. And let's not kid ourselves, money talks. So if you're successful in grants, thus increasing your level of granting, even if people had second thoughts about these changes that one would be bringing forward, they, in a certain sense, this third-party validation that comes from granting bodies, that comes from the arts milieu being interested in Black artists because of market, because of sales of works, suddenly it translates in internally people going, ooh, this Black girl with her ideas of showing exhibition of only Black people that I was second guessing. Wow, it's certainly successful. Okay, maybe. So we have to do that work to slowly but surely, as one of my staff would say, win people over. Whereas white people never have to win anybody over. They just march and do it. And that's why I think we're much more strategic in everything we do, because we need to be thinking of a lot of steps ahead in order to bring those changes that are necessary. And the last thing I'd like to say is that for me at the power plant, what has been my greatest, I would say, joy of the last few months is, as you know, following the murder of George Floyd and the reckoning that our field has been having, is to have patrons, mostly white patrons that have been supporting the power plant, say, oh my God, thank you, because everything you had been doing for the last few years, when this came about, they were also part of the support that enables the power plant to move forward. Because one thing everybody in the audience needs to know, you never achieve anything on your own. You always have people supporting you. And in my position, it could be having a board that's completely white. It could be having a group of staff that is white or HR, but it doesn't mean it's not necessarily about the color of the people around the table. It's the ability to support. So hearing some of our patrons and donors saying, we believed, we followed, we understood, and now mainstream is catching up, and they feel that they've contributed to, this idea of a better shared future together.
I'm just going to jump in there. I think, and Shelley, you might be thinking the same thing, that I don't want our conversation to become othered, because all of us, like literally the trajectory of our career, because we're usually one of the few. I used to have meetings when Maxine was an executive at TIFF, where we would meet for brunch. We literally started meeting every Saturday just to have the ability to deconstruct the fact that we would literally be, oh, what room were you the only one in? Some of what was intel to identify allies, or I prefer the term since this past summer of co-conspirators. And it's like white corporate philanthropic leaders with tons of government experience. I have to hail up my board, Charlie Coffey, for this one, because he's one of those people that's just senior executive, retired from RBC, very well respected, mentored people like the late Raymond Chang when he was starting to do his philanthropy with the stuff at Ryerson and with the this support for the University of the West Indies. And he's the guy, like you meet him for lunch and he just have exceptional advice on who to talk to about what, how to approach something, sometimes just to vent. So that idea of allyship, I think all of us who know our history knows that the allies have always been there and are key. And I think we just have to start to look at, okay, how do you step that up as we start to move the needle forward? But yeah, the allyship it's a key component for what we all do.
Yeah, and I would say that, and both Gaëtane and Karen are so right. We don't get where we are today. We didn't get here alone. It's due to amazing mentorship and also the incredible staffs that we have worked with and our colleagues over the years and the allies that are out there. But, I've always loved that line that Mintzberg, the McGill management professor, has always said about, and he throws museums in there as well, universities, hospitals, museums. They're fabulous places to work in. And they are some of the most challenging organizations to run. And the reasons are so complex because the places we work in are very complex and our constituents are so complex. What I thought was interesting about something Gaëtane said was that I think we all have to recognize too that all three of us are women. And I would actually say that there's an experience that I think a lot of women would share in what you said, Gaëtane, about coming in and making change, and the way that maybe we collaborate a bit more, we negotiate to make those changes. So I think that's what a lot of women would talk about, whereas I think white men have liberty to do things that would just be unheard of for so many of us. But I think, and you're right, there's those, all of those, whether it's the Canada Council and the Ontario Arts Council, for an organization like mine where we are so very thinly government funded. And so I have to rely on the collector community. I rely on my sponsors, and I know the two of you do too, and the corporate community. So you are always, the networks that you are working in and negotiating with constantly has to be something you're really comfortable with. And I think something that the three of us share, and both of you mentioned this word, othering. I grew up in a mixed home. My father is Black Jamaican. My mother's white Jewish European. And all of their friends that used to come in from McGill, everything was always very mixed up and different. So to me, when I'm in an environment or a room that's all anything, I'm immediately concerned. So it worries me when it's all of one thing. And I think there's a value, and this is the piece that I think, and why I work in what I work in museums, which is that the value system of museums that we represent and where they came from are supposed to be about equity in your community and sharing knowledge. And I think to me, that's the heart of it, which I think, we have a lot of work to do when you look at who goes to our institutions. And again, the data is really clear. It's, it doesn't matter what community you're in. Toronto is the most multicultural city now, in Canada, and I think in North America. So, one of the things you have to look at, and Hamilton is becoming more so, but our audiences tend to be predominantly white, and that is all over in the data. I know, Josh, that was a question you asked me from a marketing perspective, if we knew about our audiences. So I think that's something, that we all have to really still work on.
I would like to jump in. One thing in terms of who goes to your institution, I can say that, since I started at the power plant, I've seen a shift of who comes to the power plant because our programming is speaks to the world and is culturally diverse. And one thing I will never forget, when I started, I remember I said to Karen at the time, I said, it's really interesting. I seem to see when I post jobs that there's more culturally diverse people applying. And because, I'm kind of silly, I said to Karen, do you think it's because I'm leading the institution? And she says, God, you're such a fool. Of course it's because you're leading the institution. These people now feel like, okay, maybe somebody's actually going to look at my CV and make this a place of welcome. And the one thing I want to say also, in having a very culturally diverse team, from top to bottom at the power plant, when a visitor, especially we're a contemporary art institution, so everyone, regardless of color, feels like, oof, do I understand? Am I fit to go see a contemporary art gallery? So there's already that barrier. But when they come in and at the desk, they meet Abbas Rizvi, they go, oh, okay, they see themselves in this person. And I think also something that sometimes I would say white people don't realize is their gaze onto people that are culturally diverse. People that are culturally diverse see when you have this little twitch because, they're dressed in a boo-boo or dressed in something else or have loud kids, and that you're automatically sending them a message that, you're a bit shocked to see them. Whereas when you have, and that's why I don't understand, the one thing that the business industry and banking has understood, it's all about market development, right? So it's also, do you need more people to come to your institution? Do you need more donors? Do you need more members? So if you need these people, therefore, and if you're in a community, you need to think that your programming, your team, everything must represent the community in which you are embedded. And if you don't see the diversity of publics coming to your gallery, you need to think, am I doing the right marketing in the right communities? Am I making sure that I collaborate with community centers or community newspaper or schools or et cetera, in order to bring those people in? Because I think the artists are so interested in having everyone. And the last point on this, I want to assure people listening, the public is never the problem. I've never had audiences going, why are you showing a Black artist? I've worked outside. I've worked in Joliette, Quebec, where I was probably the only Black person. Well, there were maybe 10 of us, but at least, or Lennoxville. And never in my entire career of working outside of a big center have I ever had a member of the audience question why they were not seeing just white people being represented. And so we have to, hats off to our audiences who are interested in seeing the world in our institutions, right? So they're another group of allies. But then the question is, within our program, within our staff, are we making the right effort to bring members of the diverse communities in which we find ourselves, make them feel welcome, not tell them you're going to love everything you see, but you will always be welcome, you will always be listened to, and you will never be made to feel that you do not fit within our institution. And that's a key point.
Thanks, Gaëtane. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
For Josh. This is what we're afraid of. Josh should just be okay. So I guess you're just going to jump in and be unruly now. The one thing I will say, and then I will stop and let you have your pulling us back to the realm or back in, is Gaëtane's point about audiences. I think sometimes those who work in museums forget that the fundamental role of the culture, museums, art sector is rooted both in the beginning, I think, Shelley, we talked about it, of the Louvre in the, late 17th or 18th century, and then the Great Exhibition of the 19th century that is Victorian era, that was Victoria and Albert's initiative, which was about, to Gaëtane's point, you brought the world to a community that couldn't necessarily go see the world. And so for me, all we should be thinking about is we've actually, most of us, never fulfilled on that promise. The promise of what you are supposed to do as a cultural institution is bring the world. Historically, we brought the world in the worst ways, most racist, inappropriate, imperialist ways with the wrong ideas around identity. And now, you know better, so you do better, but still bring people the world wherever you are in this province, in this country. Your job should be about that broader, bigger education. And I also think we know that most people who are curious about culture, they're curious. They're like, sometimes we get in there and we're not curious. We're more interested in the things and the people. And whereas the people are curious. So it's like we're holding the audiences and the community back. They're there and we're not there. So I think we need to get there and fulfill the promise that is what we are mandated to be if we work in this sector.
And just to add to what Karen is saying and touching on poor Josh.
Well, the three of us will never be allowed on these things together again.
We warned them. What you're touching on is the public dimension. I mean, we're not private art museums or cultural institutions. In Canada, we are public. And I have found that enormously frustrating, that we have difficulty realizing that to the extent that we should. And I have noticed over my career, I would say in some ways there was more effort around that public dimension 25 years ago, when I think of my mentors and leaders in the field, than sometimes today. And I think, and I'm sorry to say this, because sometimes you do have to follow the money, but I think it has to some degree to do with the declining amount of government funding that has occurred with our public institutions. As a dear colleague of all of ours reminded me many months ago, the ROM at one point was funded to the tune of over 90% by the government. Well, and this is true right across the board for all of our cultural institutions. The drop of government funding has now dropped. It sits in Canada somewhere between, on average, 32, 33 to 57%. Well, what's made up the difference? It's private funding. So, and I know you're going to go there, Josh, but I think it's the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet, but the perceived elitism and I think the elitism that does go on in our institutions.
No apologies necessary. When Karen and Dave called me about this, the first thought I had was, are you sure you need a moderator? You have Gaëtane, Karen, and Shelley in a room on a call together. They'll do just fine. So anyhow, thank you all. You're essentially doing my job for me. Gaëtane, you mentioned something that I thought was really interesting about sort of museum audiences and communities, and it reminds me of this museum professional, I believe out of Manchester, who speaks of this notion that museums and art galleries are often so focused on their collections when they should be really what they should be focused on is collecting relationships with communities and the communities that they serve. And I'd like to sort of use that as a springboard, getting back to another thing that sort of Karen was alluding to, which is this sort of the colonial underpinnings of museums and art galleries. Museums are part of a colonial paradigm and were born out of this imperialist perspective. And you even have sort of, organizations like the International Council of Museums over the last couple of years had even proposed to redefine what a museum is. And that all sort of, alludes to this question of, what does decolonization of the various collections, galleries, and museums look like? And are we reaching a time where we need to redefine and potentially redesign the purpose of museums and art galleries?
Well, I won't say a lot of this in terms that I don't have a collection, and I'm so thankful that I don't have a collection. I'm very happy not to have a collection because I think that, and I was trained as a museum director, trained as an art historian, so very much focused on objects. And I've done, I've worked at what used to be the Musée d'Art Africain Océanien in Paris, and I must say that the more I delved into especially African art, the more I always felt somewhere in my heart that, if I had to lead an organization that had this type of artwork, I would send it all back. And what's very interesting is places like France, where never, ever would they ever think of sending works back, how President Macron and all of the work that's been happening, how museums are forced to change now, and they are having committees to, the same way we had committees that were looking at the provenance of Jewish looted art, right, which was somewhat of a revolution to do this type of work. Now we're having more and more institutions, not all of them, but questioning, what is the legitimacy of holding these works of art, these objects that were never given, never purchased, but stolen and documented. When we think of the bronzes, the Benin bronzes, everybody knows they were stolen. So anyone who has them in their collection will have to be thinking of that historical. So I think that they will be forced and are forced to rethink it. And there will be a shift because, of course, if you look at the generation of people holding these positions within these organizations, they were not trained to even question, where the works came from and which communities they were stolen from. But in that sense, I think there is a call for changing these questions that are at the core of what a museum does, which is to hold collections. So I think somebody like Shelley or Karen can also definitely expand on this, because it's not a problem that I have right now in my position, but it is a question that I think about very often.
I for one am, and most people that know me know this, I'm quite skeptical of the decolonization of museums, the term that everyone keeps throwing around. I find that there's been a lot of empty rhetoric around that. And the reason being that I think, and I know my colleagues would agree with me, I think they need to be reimagined. And it's very hard to decolonize something which is a fundamentally colonial construct, which is what those of us as collecting institutions, especially if we're older, that's exactly what we represent. And to also touch on the point you raised earlier, Josh, about, where we come from. Well, most of us trained as art historians and of a certain age, we represent the canon. And so if you think about the training that we all had and the way that we looked at collections and the way the Academy looks at collections, it's not a surprise that museums have behaved the way they have. So I think it's about museums being fundamentally reimagined. I think we're at the very beginnings of that. And I think France, it's incredible with France. I think the Dutch are now doing that as well, Gaëtane. I just read about the Dutch are now about to do the same thing. The day the Elgin marbles go back, we'll, that will be, I think we've done it. We did it right with the Nazi looted art. We have a long way to go, but I think to shift from being object-based to thinking much more about our publics is going to be a big one, to stepping outside of the canon, right? To rethinking the way that we do things, the time we take to do things, our inability to be nimble in our world. I mean, it's very difficult for museums, especially of a certain size, to react to what's going on immediately within their communities. So I think, the signs are good, but I think we're in the very early days.
I'm going to give a plug out to Myseum and the work that we did there. Myself, Britt, Josh, who were, I think, the first three people there in the beginning for building this thing, which was focused on community. And it was this idea of building a museum concept that was centered on community and people and those stories. And that for me, and again, you guys know this, as a museum professional, the stuff is only as interesting as the stories that connect back to our common humanity. So I'm happy to be, like Gaëtane, at a collecting institution. I feel like the range of things I've done in my career, this was the right time to be where I'm at. But I also can say that Shelley's point about size is a key one. I do think the opportunity for this notion around decolonization, whatever that ends up becoming or meaning, the story, the narrative thread of how that's done is partly about the government leadership, like we're seeing in France and with the Dutch, where it is about money going back into communities to literally the repair is that you build the institutions so that things can go back, because then professionals there can host, because we know that that's been one of the arguments that, oh, we can't give it back because they won't know what to do with it. And it would be just a terrible atrocity to just throw it back to people who don't have the resources for housing artifacts and ephemera and art in the right way. But for us, I think in North American and other European institutions and organizations that are medium, small, especially something like the MacLaren, where the collection is, under 30 years old, there isn't something where you've got that longer history necessarily. The story is really about how can you look at what your collection is, start to look at one representation, so that for a lot of us in Canadian art institutions, it's weird how we're either getting things where people have crazy money to be a part of that mass purchase of things from around the world in their travels. We see this with the role, for instance, Dr. Julie Crooks has at the AGO around the Africa and the diaspora, a lot of that African art collection. I think you've got things similar, Shelley, that are for wealthy people who are acquiring things at auction that were coming in weird ways from different parts of the world. So I think there's a trajectory that the smaller and the medium, because we can pivot more easily. What's that analogy that's been used since COVID, where they said the art and culture and museum world is never going to be the same. The big art fairs, the way big institutions function will never be the same, because that ability for the mass gathering, the mass travel is going to be gone or changed maybe forever. But they represent the ocean liners and the boats and the dinghies, where we can handle and deal with rough waters more easily. That, for me, is where the opportunity's at. So I'm happy to say that I think I might be running a small yacht, and we can handle some rough waters and hopefully change and pivot, but have within those changes and those moments for pivot, the opportunity for benchmarks, for bigger institutions to take those ideas and scale them up, and for smaller to maybe scale down. But I think the middle is where change will happen, and where we can make changes more easily to affect the sector in its more long term. Should we go to questions?
We're going to go into a Q&A soon. However, Dave, I'm going to apologize in advance. I want to get one more question in there before we do so, because I think it's, really connects well to the direction the conversation is taking. We talked about this idea of decolonizing museums, and that is often, viewed as this connection to the collections, and then sort of what do you do with those, and that is sort of what's anchoring this sort of like colonial underpinning. But also something that's come up and is a part of the same conversation is museums as neutral spaces, and pushing it back against that. And so I guess I wanted to get each of your thoughts on what is the voice of the museum as we go forward after 2020? Is it still neutral? Do we have a voice in some of these conversations about social justice, et cetera? Is it our duty to have a voice in some of these conversations?
I can easily start and tell you it is our duty. I believe it's those who claim that you can be neutral, even if you try to be, I think is naive and frankly verging on irresponsible. No matter what, we know curators take positions on things. We know by nature of how art is presented and how it's written, that's the way we frame discussions, the way we address and greet someone from the front of the way they enter a space, the way we sometimes hold too fast to our space, that we don't go out in the community enough to then bring people in. We don't partner enough with communities to sometimes take the preciousness out of objects and art so that people can get a point of entry into a discussion that helps them to understand everything from the most opaque contemporary art to the most classical painting by someone well-known like a Picasso or Modigliani or whoever. So I think the notion of neutrality for me, it's like, no, it's even if you think it's possible, I think you're living in delusion. It's what you do with that position. And again, what is your core responsibility, which for me is education. It's creating those safe spaces for difficult discussions where you may not always agree with someone, but you hope that having those diverse points of views, especially as we see coming out of the last 4 years of the US, and we saw what these kind of soundboards of the same voice all speaking to each other constantly does. All it does is whip up the worst of us. And the ability to get to a point where we're hearing diverse ideas and opinions to address those issues and help to unpack them. We're in trouble if we are not taking positions, especially around educating for better human beings as leaders for the next generation. I think that we have a social responsibility to take a position and to think about what kind of world do we want and what's your role as a leader and as someone working in the cultural center to help to craft a better world for the next generation. I mean, literally, I'm that delusional. That's why I work in this sector. I want to make the world a better place. And I think museums and culture is a way you bring different people together to have difficult discussions so that we all become better people and more informed about the other.
Yeah, I totally agree. I always start every exhibition with a toast to my team and the artists and saying that maybe I'm still very kumbaya, but it's like I hope that through the exhibitions that we present, that our visitors become better citizens, that they in seeing the work of an artist and the point of view that an artist present, maybe it's going to impact them on their biases, their misgiving, their racism, their everything, so that maybe it comes to them, and then when they're in the ballot box, right, voting, they might go, oh, that artist that was talking about XYZ subject matter, I hope that our visitors are better equipped through the voices of the artists that we present to think of their world from different lenses. And so we all know that art is politics. Anything we do, when you choose to show one work instead of another one, you're making a choice that says something about your own values and your own perceptions. The work of a public gallery is to be that space where those conversations can happen, and even the most difficult ones need to be addressed. And so I think that the important thing is that the views we present are not like Gaëtane Verna as an individual, but creating a space within the power plant to present these different perspectives that speak to our the role of the institution as a catalyst for a better shared future. And for me, that's very, very important that we see that role and that our boards understand it and our staff understand it, and that in everything we do, we kind of push forward that notion that we want to unpack those difficult questions through the works that artists present.
And I will just add to what my colleagues have said, because I completely agree. There's a secret here that you don't know, but we feel enormously privileged to do what we do. I mean, we love, we talk about this all the time. We love what we do. And I know how I fell in love with art history when I started to study it, because I could not believe how through a work of art you could see the world. Mm-hmm. And that's always been the marvel about, the artist's gaze or the lens. Marshall McLuhan has talked about that. So I think when you think about what our institutions need to become, for me, it's really about affirming that public dimension. I fundamentally see our institution as an educational institution. To me, that's fundamental to who we are. I'm not there for Shelley Falconer. I'm not there, and I talk to my staff, we talk about this all the time. It's not my place, it's not their place, it belongs to the community. So I think the challenge, especially those of us with these big old collections, is how, and with all these different communities that we serve and that we have to take care of and that we have to be there for, is how do we ensure and make sure that we are affirming as broadly as possible that commitment and that promise we make when we stepped into these positions to ensure the widest possible public can participate. And, I was trying to find I was looking up and I was thinking about what the African Museum at the Smithsonian did when they wanted to, and they knew they were embarking on this incredible mission to create this great museum in Washington. And for those of you that have never been, you should go. When they realized they didn't have a collection, in the early days, and I always think about this story, they talked about maybe just doing everything digitally because they didn't have the artifacts to tell the story of the African experience in the United States. What I love that they did is he was literally inspired by the Antique Roadshow, and he went into every town in the United States with his team of curators. They went out to the community to find things from people's attics and their basements. And so when you walk through that museum, you're seeing what came from the people, and they had it. It was all there. But of course, it wasn't sitting in any of the traditional or conventional museums or white museums. So, I think the stories are there. I think I think you're absolutely right what both of you said. It's about going out to our community. You can't just expect to sit back, as I think we have been complacent in the museum world, and the public is just going to come and show up at our doors. There has to be a willingness to also go out into the community.
I will. We have like 10 minutes for 7 questions.
Sorry. Sorry, Josh.
No worries. I mean, it's been a fantastic discussion so far, and
10 minutes. We could go to 3:40. Who knows?
It would only be a problem if we were boring people with our additional 10 minutes, and I don't think that's the case. So we'll be all right. We have a few questions to get through. There's one that I'm going to start with. It really resonates with me and the work that I do at both Myseum of Toronto and at BAND, the Black Artists Networks and Dialogue. It comes from a Black artist who is struggling to find a place to show their work. And basically ask this question, what are the panelists' strategies around programming Black Toronto-based artists? Black Toronto-based artists. And basically, are there avenues at your respective institutions for them to reach out to? What are some strategies that they could employ to ensure that their work can be shown?
I can just quickly say that what I did in Toronto is what we're working on in Barrie, which is research. And then we're looking at something called MacLaren Offsite, which is not everyone's going to be ready for the institution, but you have a responsibility because of the knowledge you have around what ready looks like to maybe create systems for partnering with people to do pop-up exhibitions and to help cultivate cultural ecosystems so that artist-run centers and other small galleries and nonprofits, just the type of things that allows young people to even form small groups to experiment and maybe be in your space on a temporary and formal basis, or as an institution or a cultural leader, you usually have access to other spaces or knowledge of access to other spaces. So, I mean, if they're Black and in Toronto, BAND is obviously an option for folks to reach out to. But I've also been saying in Toronto to folks that have come to BAND that it would be great to do something in the East End and Scarborough just to encourage young groups of Black artists to get together and start collectives. One, because they can get funding from provincial and federal institutions under a collective umbrella, and also just the opportunity to experiment on how and where they might show in a temporary basis. It will allow them that experimentation, and it will broaden and diversify the cultural ecosystem, which I think every great city needs a diverse range of things happening at different layers of the cultural ecosystem to make the city the best place possible for people.
I could say that, one thing that I always encourage young artists is to try to do residencies, whether they're in Toronto, in Canada, in the world, go outside of your environment and try to sign up for to apply for different residencies. I would say also that one thing that I've noticed now with the situation of the pandemic is that there are new groups of younger artists, collectives. There's the Plum. There's another small gallery near my house, which is literally a group, they're renting a garage and they do shows in this garage, which is really just a garage. So I would say to young artists, you have to, you cannot wait for people to call on you. You create also certain initiatives. And I know NIA Center has been doing a lot of work, just much like Band has been doing, but also you can start your own small collective. And, sadly, there will be spaces that are left empty for a while because of COVID. So get together, figure out the money, rent the space for a small time, apply to grants at Toronto Arts Council, be a self-starter. Don't be afraid to email, curators in our institutions. I always tell people, email me, and even if I don't answer you, keep emailing me, because it doesn't mean that I don't see you. It's just that I might not have time. And there are artists who, it took a while, but then I went to their studios and the exchange that we can have in a studio visit doesn't mean that it automatically lends you an exhibition. But I can even tell you, talk to so-and-so. Or if somebody reaches out to me to say, do you know any young artists? At least you'll come back to my mind because I've seen the work. And also the exchange and growth as an artist can come from conversation with other people. And, I did a show with an artist in January 2020, Dawid Petros, and he reminded me that I was the first professional studio visit he had like 23 years ago when he finished his BA at Concordia. And I followed his work all these years. And this was the time that we were able to work together. So I think, be a self-starter, create your collective. There's artist-run centers. There's many different opportunities, but of course it's difficult. And that's why I have so much respect for artists, because being artists is really, really a challenging, task that one decides that their life will be dedicated to being an artist. And so finding different opportunities and creating these opportunities is essential.
Yeah, I would agree too, that I think that I'm just, I have adult children now, and I'm amazed at what my daughter does as a young art, in her community of friends, and how innovative about, don't be afraid to try new things. And also don't be afraid to reach out and to think in a multidisciplinary way about reaching out to your colleagues in the arts and theater and musicians to work with them together to do interesting things. But I think you'll find a lot of us, the openness is there now. I certainly know in our organization, we are prioritizing BIPOC studio visits right now and creating opportunities so that communities that may have felt uncomfortable in the past submitting portfolios to the AGH art sale, for example. Well, we're making sure that those opportunities are there so that everyone feels welcome. So I agree with Gaëtane. Send us emails and pester, and just because we don't answer right away, it's our job to respond to you. But we will, our curators will, but don't give up, just keep going.
Thank you. I just want to extend that question or add to that. There was another question about mentorship for Black youth that I think is really linked to the same thing for Black artists and extends outside of just the arts world, which is, if you are a young Black person or just a young person in general looking for a mentor, I think it's the same solution. Just find somebody who does what you want to do and send them an email. I think anyone on this call will do their best to address that person, have a coffee with that person if necessary. And so I think that, we're talking much about sort of how can Black artists get their artwork shown, but I think it goes, across the board for any young people, young Black people. If you want to break through and there's somebody who is doing things that you want to do, or is a sort of a gatekeeper in an industry you want to get into, you sometimes just take the initiative yourself, send an email, and see if somebody will get back to you.
Josh, I just want to say that I think the three of us, I mean, I know that the way my parents raised me, it's like we were raised like if you walk into a room and there's another Black person, you go sit next to them or you say hello. So at the same time, if, I will never turn away anyone who's going to ask me, because I also know that as I said before, there's countless people of all colors who have answered those information emails that, can you meet with me and just share with me how you, and when you take the time to do this, as you've mentioned, and the person meets with you, then you never know. There might be a job, there might be an opportunity, and you come to their mind. And this type of networking, we like young Black people who want to be in this field or artists of any age, by all means, ask us, flood us, don't give up on us. And we will, I can tell you, I will answer you. It doesn't mean that I'll see you right away, but I believe that it is my role to be there because one of the first thing when I started at the power plant, and my CEO at the time, Bill Boyle, I had said to him, I don't want to be the only one. And he said, what? I said, look at me. I don't want to be the only one. So I can speak for my colleagues. The reason I say it, because I know that we share between each other. When Karen sees an artist that she might think is not ready for the power plant and says, where else could we help this person? I'm always happy to jump on a call with her and share information. And we know so many different people, not only in Toronto, in Canada, but also in the world. We are aware of a lot of opportunities. And I would say to artists, don't only think of here. You could be very successful in Singapore and be from Toronto, and it might take Toronto time to notice you, but whoever notices you, work this angle and keep expanding your horizons.
Global, then local.
Thank you so much. Going to change gears just a little bit here. I have been keeping an eye on the chat throughout this whole conversation, and a lot of comments came up about boards in the arts and culture sector. And so we have a question here. Do you think that we need to see government take a role in mandating diversity on boards of public charities such as museums?
Well, I think I'll start by saying that if you're going to talk about leadership, you have to talk about your boards. And, when I said earlier that our institutions are complicated places, we want obviously people on our boards to be people who want to be there and to be supportive. But if they don't reflect the community and that diversity isn't there at the top, then I think it's really hard to trickle diversity through the organization. So I think we've gotten better in the last few years on the boards. When I think over 20, 25 years, but I think we could do much better. I know that certainly our board, for example, EGH, is going through a complete rethink this year with great intention to in a much more meaningful way to diversify the board. So does it need to be government mandated? I don't know. I think a lot of the funding arms are certainly using that as part of the criteria to fund organizations. So I would say it is right now in some ways.
It's there. It's carrot and stick. It's there already. It's just a matter of executing. So
That's right.
I agree with you. I don't think we need to add more to that. It literally is in policy for a lot of the funders that they're watching that, and it's now just a matter of execution and us being ready, right? So that we're comfortable from racialized communities to apply to be in those rings, because they're not easy positions to be in. And that in itself is a whole other panel on how to get that knowledge and experience for governance, which is why I like to encourage young people to start things, because you can experiment and figure out things that will then allow you to be able to be in those leadership roles. I think Dave's cueing us.
Well, I would just say that that is something that everyone is aware of. I mean, sadly, because of, the reckoning around George Floyd, but I think it is a conversation in our field at all levels that everybody realized this. And then I would say, lastly, it's like, this notion that only white people have money in this country is completely false. And so, but the one thing is, if you don't invite racialized people and reach out to them and say, would you be interested in taking part in my board? They're going to stay in their communities, in their churches, in their groupings, and then we never expand and we never break silos. And I do the work I do because I believe in wanting to live in a community where we are constantly breaking silos and that we're all around the table and inviting other people to also be part of that conversation. Because if you're not sitting at the table, how could we exchange and understand the perspective that we might be missing, and for me, that also expands to accessibility and people living with disability. All of this is part of this equity work that needs to be done at our boards.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank all the panelists for joining us today. I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining. And last but not least, thank the Lieutenant Governor's office for, supporting us and providing this platform to have this conversation. And with that said, I would like to hand things over to Her Honor.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of words to close. Words of thanks. It was such a privilege to be part of the conversation this afternoon. And what I'm thankful for is not only your thoughtfulness, but also your openness. It takes a certain amount of courage to expose your worldview to a group of people. And that is so important because it starts this whole process of empathy, of telling your story so that others can start to see themselves as having possibilities. So that's message number one, my sincere thanks to all of you. And my second message to the audience, this is a really important moment in time. And it's such an important moment because there is an opening for voices and visions to be heard. We have this opportunity to help design a better normal. And that's why phrases that you used consistently, like thinking of the other, are exactly what is needed at this moment in time. It'll happen piece by piece, but let us not simply be observers. Let us actually try and shape what we see as a better normal. And never forget that it is the arts that really will help us all heal. And we're all going to need that in the coming days. So I hope you'll be safe and well, our panelists and our audience, be safe and well, and certainly enjoy the rest of Black History Month. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Your Honor, and thanks again to all our lovely panelists and Josh, of course, for doing an incredible job as moderator, and Your Honor, the team behind you. Just very quickly on the note of representation, just so you all know the impact of today's session, we did have someone who wrote in the chat, her name is Daju Cottrell, and Daju wrote, I find myself tearing up during this talk because I did not know it would be possible to see Black women like myself in power positions within museums. Thank you for doing this talk and for sharing your insightful ideas. It reinforces my faith in this profession and my future in it. So if we're ever worried about the question of representation, this is exactly the reach that you've had. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we wish you a wonderful rest of Black History Month. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.